So for those of you who've not been in one of our events before, I'm Tony Hodgson, and I'm one of the founder trustees of the H3 Uni Enterprise, which is a not-for-profit educational experiment. And I've been pulling together some of the strands of mine own and colleagues over the years that we think might be useful for the situation that we now find ourselves in. I've called it the art of creative collaboration. The reason for that, I think, will become clear as we go along. But I'd like to start off with the proposition that we find a very useful summary of where we're at right now in the world. And the idea is that entering the Anthropocene, defined as the epoch where the scale of human interference in the planet and the biosphere is on a scale that is geological in its impact, is something that our consciousness is not ready for. And we can see that from the amazing range of partial but inadequate responses, as well as the huge amount of denial and looking the other way. So we see that as three tragedies. The tragedy of the commons, you'll probably mostly be familiar with from systems thinking and ecology. The idea that if there's a village green and everyone can put their cows on it, the more successful they are, the more they live around the village green, the more cows they put on it, and eventually destroy the resource that they're living off. The tragedy of the horizon is about the short-termism, some of which is a cultural conditioning, but some of it is perhaps our evolutionary heritage, that survival historically over thousands of years has been in getting through the day and not looking particularly far ahead. But that means that we neglect the commitment to try things and do things that are unusual and new, because we see the consequences of carrying on the way we are now. But we can't push that horizon out. And the tragedy of consciousness is, sadly, the lack of it, that we're generally sleepwalking into the other two tragedies. And somehow we seem to be locked into that. So here's one simple way of looking at it, that we're trapped in these tragedies because of certain conditions that affect our brains. It's clear, if you look at domestic and world affairs, that there are huge numbers of people with fixed beliefs that are not changing. There's huge ignorance as to what's really going on, including denial type of ignorance. There's distortion in that fake news has largely displaced anything we might call truth. And there's factional exploitation in that people with power and resources continue to extract and accumulate resources. So you get the growing divide between the 1% and the 99%. And there are all kinds of fantasies or ideologies around, whether it be about consumerism or the historical Russia, or the rising supremacy of the Chinese people, or the right of the Brits to own the planet, and so on. All of those kind of myths dominate. And so the idea that we can just simply have better collaboration, carrying on the way that we've got to here, doesn't seem very tenable. And one of the reasons for this, out of several, I've just picked one, is the fascinating work by Ian McGilchrist on the right and left hemispheres. I'm not talking about what used to be, the right brain, left brain stuff of old, which is largely inaccurate and is considered so by McGilchrist, but the more recent comprehensive research that brings together a great amount of psychology and neurobiology and psychiatry and so on. And it does seem that the short-termism and inability to see the system dynamics of the commons is a natural function of the left brain. It's not surprising if the left brain is dominant, whereas the right hemisphere is our inherent capacity to have vision, to see the bigger picture, to think holistically, to be more inclusive, more empathetic, and so on. And it's interesting that McGilchrist's previous book, before his mighty two-volume tome that's recently came out, which I can hardly lift off the desk, it's got about 5,000 citations in it, that was summed up as in the title of his book, The Master and His Emissary. And his case was that the way we seem to be structured is that the right hemisphere should be the master, which incidentally connects much more empathetically with the emotional intelligence and the spiritual intelligence. And the left brain should be the servant. And we've got the servant running the master in our culture. So if we're going to have any effect on getting out of the Anthropocene traps, we need approaches which involve the whole person as far as possible. So I've been particularly concerned in my research over the years in study, in practice, in more academic type research, and in innovation, to understand the role of learning, particularly deep learning, meaning not learning of information, but learning of, for example, different ways of seeing, different ways of understanding, and so on. And I'd like to sum that up by quoting a client of mine from, must be heavens, about 40 years ago now, who had a big impact on my thinking. He was a senior executive in a large corporation. And to the conventional view, paradoxically, he was very interested in learning. And he said what obsessed him was something like this, I'm just paraphrasing. Why, when a group of intelligent people come together to share a task, do they so frequently amount to one idiot? Let's think about it. I'm taking a number of smiles and grins around the screen to indicate you get it. You've been there, you experience it. Okay. So there's something else weird going on, as well as this sort of state of our brain, if we use that as a kind of shorthand. So I've pulled together and distilled from countless threads a picture of what I consider an effective state of the human being is to be very conducive to creative collaboration. I'm not putting it forward as the answer. I'm simply offering it as 40 or 50 years of investigation in myself and in others and situations of this predicament. And in the spirit of learning, it is extremely unfinished business. But having said that, we're also living in the now. We need to be able to improve our way of being in the world right from this very moment. So in the tradition of visual thinking, or I'm very interested also in the more Eastern versions of using mandalas to concentrate knowledge. I've got a little mandala here that I've been using and proposing 8 capability areas. Now, those of you who are familiar with H3 Uni's methods like 3 Horizons or the World Model or navigating dilemmas and so on, I'm not talking about that kind of capability, about what we might call the tools of the trade. I'm talking about the condition and state and capability of the craftsperson using the tools. So there are some headings here which simply act as a kind of way of gathering a segment together. If you look through them and you consider that they've all got skills and techniques and other aids, as it were, connected with them, it's pretty complex. But actually, at the heart of them is our human experience. So I think it's useful to realize that although you could say that my speciality has been included, not entirely exclusively, but included what you might call the profession of facilitator, that actually this is about being human, that creative collaboration really is helped the more human we are. And there are many factors in society that hide that humanity and bury it and distort it. So let's look at this in a very simple way. So I put an outer circle around this, which is just some thoughts about everyday experience that will connect with this this view. Let's start with self-awareness. That's a lifetime's experience in itself, but we can start from the fact that we all recognize that we have moments of reflection, somehow of sitting back, of experiencing a stronger, as it were, observation of ourselves, an ability perhaps to, for a moment at least, to pass impartial judgment on our own nature and behavior. And that's one of the things which creative collaboration needs, that it needs that capacity of any individual in the process of collaborating to be able to more impartially review their own behavior and performance. Clearly, if we're going to have collaboration, then if people have no feeling for the other, that somehow people are objects to be controlled and engineered, then that may be effective for getting certain things done, but it's certainly not very effective for evoking shared creativity. I had a strong experience of that. I think I was probably about 22 years old the first time I went to New York, and I was probably in a taxi from the airport to the city, and I noticed that the cabbie had a little card stuck on his dashboard which simply said, "Let me not criticize any man until I've walked a mile in his moccasins." And obviously it had some guy with the feathers on his head next to the words. Very simple, but at that moment in my life, that was a very kind of jolt. It really struck me. So without feeling for the other, it's hard to actually be a catalyst for creative collaboration. Obviously, creation, although it has that quality very often of what you might call spontaneous eruption, it just pops out, the famous light bulb experience, that's usually taken on its own, a deception, that actually creativity is an ongoing process that goes through stages and phases. And a bit like a river in porous geology, it runs above ground and underground, and that keeps changing. So having a sense of the process of what are we going through here? Now, the visual artist, say, painting a picture, or the musician composing a piece of music, has a sense of process. They may not have a kind of codified discipline, or they might indeed be very disciplined indeed in the way that they paint pictures or write novels. But when we look at world problems and the way politicians work and the way policy people work and the way people operate in local authorities and companies and all that, often process awareness is quite limited. Fortunately, I had as a client for a while one company that was very competent at that level, and they were relatively a joy to work with. Another area that we all experience, of course, is, we have a good conversation. We've got together with somebody or a small group that we get on with, and we're trying to sort something out, and there's a really good flow going, and in a more developed way, that's obviously the basis of dialogue methods. So if we're not kind of having that kind of interactive skill, then that's not going to be particularly helpful for creative collaboration. And then there's a question of, well, what is the kind of task that we're engaging in? Now, I mentioned a few arts analogies because we more usually associate that with creativity. But actually, if we're trying to design something, or we're trying to solve a difficult, even technological problem, or we're trying to resolve some kind of political impasse, it helps to have a method or two that actually match the condition we're trying to deal with. So, for example, in the H3Uni experiment, you'll find on our website 5 key methods that we've singled out. Actually, we've got a library building up of about, I don't know, anything from 20 to 50, depending on how you cut it, but it's going to take us a while to actually pull those through into visibility. So if you're in a very tense standoff situation, but there's some hope of dialogue, then having the method of dilemma resolution, for example, gives you a way of actually structuring a process and a conversation and developing mutual feelings and so on, and creating a reflective space to actually progress that kind of difficulty. Whereas without it, you tend to get projection of assumptions and conflict, and it just goes around in circles. We're having quite a lot of that in the UK at the moment with the cost of living crisis. It's very interesting to see how the absence of any skill at dilemma resolution is tubing the economy, frankly. And then there's something about pattern recognition. We all have some sense of beauty or form or elegance or economy, in the sense of the quality of doing things with the minimum effort for the maximum effect. And we've drawn a lot on pattern thinking, and some of that stems from way back in the origins of systems science of Gregory Bateson's statement about understanding the pattern that connects. And so one of the things you'll find we're working on in H3Uni is something we call pattern dynamics. And then there's also something conventionally we perhaps call it getting to the point, or cut to the chase, or what's this really about? But intuitively, that's something that we all have a capacity for, which is, in certain circumstances, we just kind of tune in to the heart of it, and it's not it's not against rationality, but it isn't arrived at through a rational process. But can we cultivate that? Can we turn it into a skill? And then we've got the final one here, which is around the area of mental repatterning. How do we actually change our mind? If you look at human behavior around the planet, there's quite a lot of fixation, ideology, belief systems, and those tend to form into tribes and cults, even the cult of consumerism, although they don't call it a cult. And then that becomes set against other belief systems, and you've got religious wars, you've got political wars, you've got domestic wars, and so on and so on. So part of learning is how can we actually help ourselves and others to change our minds in a positive way. Obviously, we don't want to go the opposite extreme and can't make our minds up about anything and we're vacillating. Actually, that's a subconscious fixation as well. It's just more buried. So one of the key word pair that we've come up with in our research is participative repatterning. That is the idea that everyone needs to join in. In other words, it's not like what I'm doing now. This is not participative repatterning. I'm giving a lecture. It's different. But the repatterning is we're sharing our joint change of mind so that hopefully we arrive at a different map of the world that none of us have seen before, which is co-created out of the contributions and interactions that have been going on. Okay, so let's just whirl through these at the more sort of technical level. And this is a whirlwind, because the whole idea of designing a course to run next year is to actually give each of these 8 zones a whole hour and a half to itself to actually go into it more thoroughly. So cognitive framing and reframing is really, what is our mental tool set? And coupled with that, something that's often overlooked is that often groups meet together to share a task when they haven't actually stood back and got clarity about what the task really is. And so people aren't even setting off on the same page. And so the idea of having a set of tools for that, which is part of our resource library idea, comes into that. But there are all kinds of other things besides that. But the important thing is that the tools actually match the nature of ambiguity and uncertainty and open challenge that a creative task requires. Interactive skill. Well, the obvious thing here is, of course, around the theme of inclusion and all voices shall be heard, and recognizing that part of creative collaboration is the, you might almost call it a faith that everyone involved has something to contribute. It may be the weakest voice that has got the most critical factor in their mind to actually share in the group. So if you have a sort of voices being drowned out in a task group, then that's not going to develop the interactive skill that's needed. Then there's the mysterious area of group dynamics. I learnt in my 20s and 30s and partly studied the work of the Tavistock Institute in London on the nature of group behavior and the idea of task groups have us generate their own group subconscious, which tends to have quite different purposes from the ostensible task. So you might have a project group that is meeting to create a certain object or something, and yet the behavior of the group seems to be guided from an outside observer by some other principle. And in fact, there's a whole science of group basic assumptions, which you approach by saying reflectively, it's like seeing this group claims to be designing a gadget, but it's actually behaving as if it was there to kill the leader, and things like that. So you get the perverse dynamics determining the outcomes, and that blocks the creative flow. So how do you handle that? A double loop learning is one factor where, for example, the second loop is not learning about, but learning how we're learning. It's being able to reflect on our assumptions. The empathetic appreciation particularly in a high performance environment, how people are feeling is that's unprofessional, isn't it? So you put that aside. And yet how people are feeling is going to be absolutely critical for creative activity. So the more the facilitator or the group together can actually feel what we're all going through, that's why in group meetings, for example, there is value in a check-in, which we haven't done in this meeting because we're not working that way. But you know, we've all come to this talk with a bunch of history and feelings and anticipations and what the hell's going to happen next and how long is he going to go on for and so on, and all of that would inhibit the free flow of ideas if it wasn't dealt with, which leads to self-awareness. And I think one of the key things in self-awareness is, particularly if you're playing the facilitator role, is the power of projection. That how we need to be sensitive, and we are sensitive, but that means we pick up all kinds of feelings going on in other people that may have actually nothing to do directly with or causatively with our situation. And so we end up, say, feeling depressed when it's not our depression, or we end up feeling agitated and anxious when it isn't our anxiety. And particularly in creative work, the nature of the creative process usually, or must in a sense, go through some kind of crisis, some kind of, oh, it's all falling apart, or it's never going to work, or we'll never make it. And holding the space so that the group can come through that and come out the other side is really important. But it's not possible for that to happen if we get swamped by the anxiety. And then I mentioned the mental repatterning. And here there are various techniques of what you know often have been called lateral thinking, but different ways of reframing our way of thinking, which are different from the methods that I mentioned earlier, like dilemma navigation or three horizons. They're more about how you kind of tickle your own mind or tickle the mind of the group to entertain different perspectives. And I don't know how many of you have played with metaphors, but metaphors can be a very powerful way of flipping the orientation to something. Something as crude as we seem to be thinking of it as an apple. What would happen if we thought of it as an orange? And you get segmentation coming in and so on. So those kinds of skills can be really helpful. And I think above all in creative work, something that's been in the research literature for some time, but is largely neglected because society is desperate for certainty and predictability. And if you're seen to tolerate ambiguity, it means you're not thinking straight and you're not decisive and you don't know what you're doing and you're untrustworthy, which of course may be true up to a point, but it's not true of everybody who's tolerating ambiguity. It may be that there's an open question here, and jumping to the conclusion immediately is going to kill the creativity. So one of the things I've found, particularly in the facilitator role, is, you know, when a group generally rubbish somebody's idea, I immediately latch onto it and give it credence, and try and have the contributor develop it, and then possibly, you know, shine some different angles on it, and see if it takes. And you know, sometimes that's impossible situation on day one. On day three, it's like, this is the way we're going to do it. And then the other thing, of course, that in our work we've been particularly keen on is visual patterning. That at the moment I'm majoring on verbs, you know, on verbal, on language, on speaking to you. I'm flashing up a few diagrams to perhaps help you pattern things in your mind. But if we were to actually work with the patterns intimately, which is the participative repatterning, then it's very much more powerful. And so one of the things that most of you in this group, I think, know that we're struggling with is, we got this to work beautifully with people in the same room and whiteboards, but now we've got this damn technology where we're not in the same room, or there's this kind of Zoom room thing that we're in now, which isn't entirely unreal, fortunately, but it's certainly not very concrete. And our interactions are limited, and there's a huge development needed in the technology to deal with that. So having got to there, then we have the basic skills to wrap around that, which are, in any given piece of work, what is the task? Given that it's the nature of the task, what's the appropriate method or methods? What's the context to be taken into account, including the situation and the technology? Then what's the actual process? What's the sequence? And there are various models of problem-solving processes out there, and some of them are better than others. But generally speaking, any kind of task with any complexity is usually a 6, 7, or 8-step process, which, if things are missed out, doesn't work very well. So if you picture that, you know, the human being, as it were, has got this more rounded sense and has got a few techniques and tricks to do it better, the sort of skill bit, then the job becomes understanding enough of the aim or the goal to appreciate the shared creative gap facing the group. What are we really up against here, or what is our aspiration? What is our vision? A climate in which equitable involvement is encouraged and it's energized, and there's a kind of integrity to the process that gets us through it. And that's true even of very open dialogue processes that don't appear to have much structure, but actually they do have a very key set of processes. Configuring and reconfiguring technical contexts for visual dialogue. That's the whole thing about how do we, if we're going to do collaboration, what is the collaboration space in which we operate? And of course, there are various things emerging in fields like software, agile methods, and so on, which I have mixed feelings about in terms of their clarity as to what is technical, what is additive and what is truly creative. And then there's a question of, you know, if all we've got is a hammer, then everything's a nail. So if we don't actually increase our repertoire of ways we have of approaching things, then we're limited. So one of the things I've observed in our work over the last 4 or 5 years is that even if you pick up a method, and even if you pick up some way of, in your own way of creating and holding the space for a meeting, there's something about the inner state of being able to operate in group settings that honor the different aspects of the human being that lead to a greater probability of creativity. So that's the tip of the iceberg, just for revision. And then the idea, which is provisional, is that beginning at the end of January, a course of workshops rather than lectures like this. So we try and get them to be, given the technological limitations, get them as participative as possible, to actually get a better flavor of these things. And hopefully, I mean, those of you experienced in this field, which I guess is probably most of you here in this session, have all got development experience and learning in different facets of this. But there's something about maybe the way it all comes together, which might be for you a creative step if you signed up to it. And if you want to take a quick look at participative repatterning, chapter 6 of my book, I have to do one commercial at the end, is worth a read. It's got some practical exercises in. So, phew, I think I managed to do that in about 45 minutes, which is quite a mouthful. But anyway, I'm now going to sit back and see what you fancy going into or sharing from your experience as well. I mean, you know, parallel experiences are welcome.
Morning, Tony. I'll kick off, shall I?
Phil. Yeah, bright and early.
Indeed. There's a couple of us down from New Zealand, so yes, the cohort's growing. Yeah, I put a question in the chat, which kind of struck me, I suppose, going around that is that, and if it was perhaps triggered, I think, in terms of the self-awareness piece, I think it wasn't the word you used, but almost a dispassionate view of where I am and my position, as it were, which kind of obviously itself is a challenging statement because we're wrapped up in ourselves, and being apart from ourselves is a challenging concept in its own right. And then, of course, within a group itself, I am a part of the dynamic, and the dynamic is affected by my interaction too. And so there's almost a necessity to parse both my internal state and also how my own engagement with the group changes the group, but also then there's the relationships between the two, in that I have a particular role to play within a group, and to what extent does that role have a particular change on the dynamics? And I wonder if that's the sort of thing that you might be exploring as well as part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of observation, Phil, is as it were at the next level of integration. It's like these factors are interacting with each other, but it's very hard to clarify that until you've got perhaps a little bit more on the factors. But for example, you could put into the self-awareness segment how confident are you? Now, if you're not confident in your process, and the subconscious group dynamic starts attacking, that this isn't the way to do it. I mean, I had an amazing, although I wouldn't want to repeat it, experience when Ari de Hurst and Peter Senge asked me to facilitate the formation meetings of the European Society for Organization Learning, which were started off in France. And I was trying to take about 25 people through a creative formation process. And all of them were facilitators with their own idea of how it should be done. And I had no authority. I was this weird outsider that Peter Senge and Ari de Hurst had brought in. And Ari particularly recognized that it probably without visual facilitation, this was, going to be impossible. And I learned in that experience that if I'd have let myself go over the edge of losing confidence, everything would have blown. But it was really touch and go. And I remember Ari who'd worked with me on a number of things. I'd worked with him, including a very complex World Bank project. He said, "Tony, I've never seen you looking so grey." So staying in that state in a challenging situation isn't just a technique; it's an actual challenge to your very being. It can be rough. I'm citing a difficult version. There are happy versions of that too, where things take off in an amazing way. But I think the simple rule there is the more you've practiced a certain kind of approach, the more you've seen how it works and how it doesn't work, and you take that into account, the more confidence you get, the more you're able to stay in the moment in the event, the more how you're feeling becomes incredible feedback on the state of the group, not on your state. So that's the projection problem. And so keeping, it's not dispassionate in the sense that you're cut off from the group. You're actually empathizing with them, but you're not getting swallowed up in the empathy. I don't know how else to put it. And I think that there are ways of almost like cognitive therapy to get oneself in better shape for that. But I realized that over the years, there's nothing like practice. You know, if you haven't jumped in the deep end, you'll never find out what it's like and how to survive. So I think one of the ways we've been able to pioneer some of these things is a kind of informed foolhardiness of rushing in where angels fear to tread and somehow getting away with it. Because how else do you develop practice? How else do you develop a different way of doing things if you don't do it?
Mm.
So we've changed, we've evolved our H3 Uni approach that it was probably something we can have another session about sometime, about the wisdom triangle, that you can have all the best methods and the best skills in the world, but if there isn't this kind of inner wisdom factor at work, then it will either be same old or it won't work, and you won't be invited back. That's happened to me quite a few times as well. Sometimes when you're successful, it upsets the power structure. So, creativity is very dangerous to some people.
Career limiting.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Oh, I haven't had a career, so I'll warn you on that. I've been, I don't know whether remember that ancient movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where they try to get the gold, and it doesn't matter whether the Confederates or the other lot, they just work their way through the battlefield to get what they're after. It's a bit like that. Okay, some more questions. What's the difference between methods and process, I notice here?
Yes, please. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it clear?
That's a good one.
I kind of feel like one is sequence and the other is more a single step of a sequence. So a method being like single step, be it like a Monte Carlo simulation, and then sequence would be onto the next thing, which is then maybe some complicated Rube Goldberg machine or whatever, followed by the next thing. But maybe I'm wrong.
I think you are, yes. Or you're incomplete.
Yeah, probably.
If you don't mind, since you invited the observation.
Yeah, go on. Anyway, what do you think it is?
Well, I think a good one to ponder this is the three horizons. You draw three lines on a piece of paper, and it isn't a step. It's more like you've marked out the football field.
Yep.
So, to me, the method is which field are we playing? Chess? Are we playing Go? Are we playing rugby? Are we playing tennis? What's the?
Yeah. They all feel like methods, right?
Yeah. Whereas the process is, if we're a football team, how are we going to play it?
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to go on the attack straight from the beginning, or are we going to kick the ball around and figure out how the other lot play, or are they really so good that we better start off with a very defensive game and feel our way in gradually and so on? So the process is it seems like a sequence, and it is in a sense, but the most important thing is the emotional energy that's associated with those steps. so that you sort of you're building through it. So I can say this to you. Not everybody will be familiar with it, but you know that's the point about the qualities of the notes in the octave.
Mhm.
That each sequential step evokes and depends on a different quality. And so designing process for a workshop, say, is as much about paying attention to that as it is about the logic of you can't do step D until you've done step B, you know, before it.
Yep, I get you. And so I'm feeling that methods are kind of a state, they're a frame. You could say they're a single qual system, whereas a process would be working through the systems, just to kind of put it in familiar context. Does that sound about right, or am I
about right? I would add one thing, that the power of the kind of methods that we're interested in is based on research into what works, not just on, you know, I don't know who invented football and how. I guess it evolved kicking a ball around or somebody's head. But there's a kind of hello. Somebody wants to come in late. There's a kind of you know, for example, the dilemma method is based on some deep research into things like family therapy and alcoholism and so on. That's, you know, that isn't kind of obvious, but that's what Gregory Bateson was working on, and Charles Hampden Turner was his PhD student, and Charles developed that with other cognitive knowledge into the dilemma theory, and then I worked with Charles to turn it into a facilitation method. So that you know the we can all draw 3 lines on a piece of paper, but which 3 lines for what reason is important too.
Nice. Thank you. Super appreciated response.
David's saying here that for him the method sets out the process that delivers its results. I think, yeah, they're kind of yin and yang, really. I think some of the work I did early on was inspired by the work of a guy at the London School of Economics who combined financial analysis with group therapy methods in a place called a pod. I don't know what became of that. I've even forgotten his name. Larry somebody or other, I think it was. But it was a very interesting example of combining the highly analytic with the highly psychological process, and in a relatively high-tech context. David, you had some questions. Do you want to kind of, David Beatty, do you want to kind of get me going?
You mean I always have questions? Well, what I'm sort of pondering over is the 3 tragedies. Because when I read the newspaper every day, there's so many evidences of that. And then trying to imagine the places where facilitating would be useful. The challenge to be able to deal with the context, the psychologies that we're all going through so quickly in so many different ways, I can see why the title of the course, Creative Collaboration, is such a must. So I'm on my 80th trip around the sun. So I'm still debating whether it's really important for me to learn these skills.
Yeah, well, if it's any consolation, I'm how can I put it? I'm on my 85th circuit of the sun, and I'm really frustrated that I still haven't got to the end of my agenda, because there's no chance of retirement in sight. You know, it was a bit. I thought it was about a 2-year program when I started in my 20s.
Is there a headline for your agenda?
Hmm?
Well,
Is there a headline for it? Not that would make sense, I don't think. No.
Okay, well, that's probably an ingredient that should be in part of the design sciences. You don't always have to know what to make sense of before you.
Well, it's. I mean, you could put it this way: that on a more personal note, I've had the benefit or the burden, depending on how you look at it, of having 4 or 5 remarkable teachers who've all fed me stuff and insights that are so central to how I feel myself that I can't put them down. You know, they're like, what else would I do? You know, as you say, this is a massive challenge, but you know, they're also, if you look at Paul Hawken's Blessed Unrest, you know, he surveyed thousands of little groups trying stuff, addressing different aspects of all this, that you know, we each try and get our own butterfly effect, I think. So,
Yeah.
but I think the idea that that we could increase the occurrence of groups of people in positions of influence, not necessarily big power folk, but sort of in between, to drop their professional guard. And it's very hard in a litigious society, and actually look at what the real situation needs.
Yeah, that's a very helpful answer. It fits for me quite a bit too, in the challenge of having the good fortune to live the life I've had so far, and recognizing that there's a lot of challenges that I'm still on the planet that I should be doing something about, but not interfering with the rights for the incoming crew members to be the leaders who are going to be staying along.
Yeah, it's the way I've heard it put, which is quite an amusing way of putting it, is, you know, be a good ancestor.
Yeah. And remember and honor the good ancestors that you have met.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Wakora or Wendy, could you elaborate on your point about choice of focus that you'd put in the.
Oh, I was just I was responding to Phil's comment of the conversation of being together and apart at the same time, being part of a whole. You know, that there's that when we choose to work together, there's always that rub of individuality and working for the alignment to the group, you know, to your smaller group and to your larger groups, larger collectives. And that choice of how much we let go of ourselves and how much what we have to say we believe is important and we want to impact what we're doing in our group. So I think the choice to focus is actually that wisdom and ethic inside ourselves of when we stand up to speak and when we choose not to. And, you know, like as a mother, I became totally about someone else when my children were born. It's like you give away everything. And then at other times, you know, what you stand up for is your focus and how we talk in group and how we choose to do our projects is about, you know, deciding the focus of what's important.
Yeah, there's a number of dimensions to what you're saying there that strike me as something to do with scale and context that it's always seemed to me that you know, there's as my appreciation of the scale of the and complexity and intractability of the global problematic grows, my sense that there's anything remotely can be done about it diminishes. And somehow, how do you navigate between those? And I must say, I turn to the spiritual dimension for that. One of my teachers' teachers was a very interesting guy who lived in Kathmandu, called the Shivpuri Baba, who died at the ripe old age of 140 something, and only got white hair when he was about 120, I think. And he was a kind of, he called himself an update of the Bhagavad Gita. And one of the principles in the Gita is Svadharma, right living. And that really we're, you know, all we can, not all, but what we can really make the kind of central inner task is to discover what our right living is. For me, this person, this individual here, that is right and just in the scheme of things, never mind what anyone else thinks. That's not easy, but it comes back partly to this confidence thing at an even deeper level. And so, you know, how do we make our peace? That's another whole. I mean, you know, I've tried to share some deeper things on that in another course, but I think it's. I don't think these things can be so easily separated now. The situation is getting so extreme that it's like Jalaluddin Rumi said, that, you know, new organs of perception emerge out of necessity. so increase your necessity. Well, I don't know, but I think the increasing necessity dial has got turned up far too far. But there it is. Maybe if we can have the courage to experiment on whatever scale and with whatever level of risk we're able to handle, something will come out of it. Something will sprout. Something will it'll all help the ecology. Anyhow, I think that's, I realize saying that out loud, it's probably an article of faith. I don't know whether I can justify it.
Does everything need to be justified?
Okay, who's left? Who's oh, just Martin is becoming a whiz on the mirror board, and so he's mirror boarded some of the stuff. I'll be interested to look at that at some point. So David, you've been musing a few things, looking down the list. Would you like to kind of muse a bit out loud?
Yeah, sure, Tony. Thanks. No, I'm just thinking that what in these sort of situations that are highly fluid and quite emotionally intense, and I've been in a few in my time, that what seemed to matter most was to get a sense of what was the most significant issue at hand, what is the and what really matters most. Not just matters to the people, but in the sort of larger scheme of things, at this present moment, what is it that matters most? And if I can get a grasp of that, that seems to have a loosening effect. If I can articulate it, that loosens up the whole. If people really feel that loosens up the structure a bit. And then we can move into something more creative. But when it's stuck, it's often people have got all different ideas of what matters. Unless one can get some coherence on that, the gathering, whatever it is, isn't going to go anywhere creative. Anyway, tuppence worth.
Yeah, that links with another observation that I've made over the years, which is that for this kind of work, any group has to recreate its own language, you know, and that's where rigid application of methods can only go so far, because as you enter the creativity field more, you need more fluidity, and you need, you know, the checking out of mutual understanding, which is part of this interactive skill segment, is critical to tune into each other's meaning.
And sometimes what matters most is not what people are really talking about.
Yeah.
And it can be quite, you know, sometimes I've been in a minority of one articulating this as to and wondering, you know, how it was going to work out. Was I going to be kicked out of the room, or were we actually going to get somewhere?
Mm.
But there's sometimes a sticking point where a bit of obstinacy is quite handy. but you need to know the ground you're being obstinate on, and it mustn't be one's own.
Yeah.
Not a sacred cow that I happen to hold in my hand, or have beside me. Yeah.
Well, I tended to use the process consulting technique of, do you mind if I share a reflection right now? Oh yes, all right, go on then. Well, it seems to me that actually what this group is really doing is da 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 da, which is, the elephant in the room, as it came to be called quite relatively recently, and just let it drop. And if anyone picks up on it, there's a chance, and if they don't, I just back off into the corner. Because it'll only work. The problem with making these steps is that they need to be voluntary, and you can't require voluntary, but you can sometimes provoke it, because in a way if it's near the surface. So that one, this thing about feeling the group is, if you begin to feel a certain level of frustration, that might be an indication that it's that some kind of constraining assumption might be pricked or burst.
Yeah. Well, can one make friends with the elephant? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, any last observations? I appreciate you sticking this out, giving me a chance to pull things together. David, were you wagging a finger there?
Yes, just a logistics question as to whether what you've shared with us tonight will be available to us to ponder over. Is there a copy of your presentation tonight that we'll be able to access?
Yeah, you caught me out there, because whereas if I'm doing a course, I kind of set up a pattern structure for that, because this is kind of pushing into new territory. I hadn't really I couldn't even predict whether there'd anybody be left in the Zoom room by now. So I haven't really thought that through. I think the simplest thing is to if you're interested in looking at this stuff and pondering it a bit more, then maybe you could drop me an email.
Okay, good, Tony. That will help me be able to be articulate enough to encourage some colleagues to take the course with me.
Okay. I'm just gonna put this in if you haven't got it. I think that's right. Yeah. So I put my email in the chat box. But the way where I'm at in my process here is, that was interesting. Now I'll have another think about it and probably do a redesign. So it wouldn't invalidate anything,
No.
I don't think, from this session. But I still feel there may be a better pattern to get into it. Sometimes I find I'm too busy working on the engineering to actually look at the user experience sufficiently. And I think the point you raised, Phil, about things working together is one that perhaps needs a bit more attention. David Beattie, you were.
Well, just saying that if you, next time you do it and you want to do it in a better way, I'll be able to compare the one you send me with the new one.
Well, if I'm true to my declaration of learning, I can't possibly object to that. Whatever you say.
Okay. I'm just
So,
trying,
so if any of you, have this has provoked anything and you want to get back at me, just drop me a note, because I have the bandwidth I've got compared to the stuff that's rattling about on my table, so to speak, means I simply can't be responsible for communication. I can only do what I can in the limited time and attention I've got, but I'm very happy to do that. So thanks for showing up. Eventually there will be a message go out through our MailChimp list, and something will go on the website. But I don't see that happening until maybe, blimey, time flies. Well, it should be done by the end of November, hopefully, to give some notice for, so that would give December, January for anyone to pick up on it and decide. And that 12 session pattern might change. It might be that that's something that needs to be in 2 parts, or something. I don't know. It's very difficult doing this, because it isn't like you've got, a bunch of master's students at a university and they kind of, they're committed to get points for doing this. It's very much a voluntary thing. But any suggestions welcome, yeah. So I'm going. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask what the MailChimp's for, because I've got a blog and a domain called tothecosmos.org that has mailing list functionality that you could use, but it depends what you use it for.
Well, yeah, the problem I have is that for those of you who've been to recent things, we've lost Celia, so we haven't got admin support at the moment. And taking stuff over, I find I've got 6 parallel email accounts, and I've only got the energy to monitor about 2 of them at any one time. I just got a note from my colleague John Hicks saying, I see you're using another email. Why is that? And there is a reason for it. But I thought, no, if I've got to explain why I'm doing this, it's even worse. But I do hope the whole point of our so-called futures group is that somehow out of that will evolve a much more streamlined thing. So it's great having suggestions to expand, but the trouble is the bandwidth to actually keep an eye on that.
But what needs to be sent out, or what gets sent out, I guess, is my question, because I'm just wondering if it can be ported, and if it can be, it's an easy port.
Well,
make life easier, right?
One item could simply be a kind of an open announcement, which we'd probably want to post on LinkedIn and Facebook and other things as well. So anything like that. If there's a multiplier effect through people's own networks, which has helped me before, that can be done, yes. As long as I don't have to monitor it. But
I'm hearing course announcements mainly. Is that in kind of the right direction? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out the content.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if we have events planned. I mean, David is developing a wisdom program which needs a kind of reset for its launch. For example, there may be opportunities to put the word around about that, but I don't have the attention right now to kind of debate that. So I'll just flag that you've made an offer there, and I think the principle is that there are probably 4 or 5 people like you knocking around in my network who are network multipliers, and I need to do a bit of. There's a guy called Bruce Goldstein at Colorado University I've done some work with, and he's doing research on he's got a name for them, net weavers. Net weavers are people who weave other people's networks, and I need to get some net weaving thinking going together, I think, on top of everything else. So anyway, take care, everybody. Whatever else you make of this, be human, and maybe see you around somewhere.
Thanks, Tony.
You're all invited to
Bye-bye.
stop by for tea if you're passing by the middle of Scotland, but it's a fairly safe bet that you won't be, but never mind. Pity. Bye then.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Byron.